Chapter 16, Intellectual Life, the Archipelago of Private Culture. Culture in Russia has been dispersed into tiny islets. Lev Navrozov, 1972. The most vital, embracing cultural life in Russia is outlaw, and therefore private. It is the art least adulterated by official canons, the most original, the least compromised, and most threatening to the official cultural world. The state knows of its existence, and fearing it has, in the words of the writer in exile, Lev Navrozov, dispersed it into tiny islets. These islets form a hidden archipelago whose life is far less well known than the life of the Gulag archipelago, so powerfully portrayed by Solzhenitsyn. Yet its existence is every bit as characteristic of Soviet society. In this private realm survives great art and literature, the richness of the pre-revolutionary Silver Age of Russian culture, the brilliant abstract art of the early Soviet period, the incomparable writing of poets pilloried or persecuted to death in the 30s. This art is not only purposefully excluded from official culture, but is being intentionally forgotten. It survives because a few undaunted individuals have nominated themselves as keepers of culture otherwise lost to contemporary Soviet society. Mostly it is the elderly who preserve a human link with the past and nourish a younger generation curious to know their full cultural heritage. For in a nation where history is constantly written and rewritten to suit the present needs of rulers, and where controversial cultural figures are frozen into vulgarized caricatures of themselves to fit the pro-Christian mold of state culture, the tradition of oral history is not just a luxury to aid future scholars, but a vital and trusted source of cultural continuity. The old Russian saying that the education of a child begins with his grandfather's education takes on special meaning when grandfathers preserve so much lore and knowledge that would be lost without their presence. Widows and sons of great poets like Osip Mandelstam and Boris Pasternak sustain the memory not only of those remarkable men, but a tactile, flesh and blood feel of the times in which they moved. Sometimes unexpected guardians of the past emerge. Noam Kleeman, a dedicated young admirer of the great Sergei Eisenstein, has not only single-handedly kept alive an apartment museum of that genius of cinema, but has initiated such projects as the careful reconstruction of an Eisenstein movie from a few extant film clips. The original movie, Bezhin Lug, had so enraged Stalinist censors with its ideological heresies that they burned all the reels both times Eisenstein made the film. As Solzhenitsyn's writings have shown, self-appointed unofficial historians have preserved the personal documentation of the Stalinist repressions that the party had tried assiduously to banish from public recollection, and underground balladeers now preserve the mood and memories of those years. Russians are great people for remembering anniversaries, and in the private archipelago of culture, important anniversaries are often occasions for the gathering of the modern equivalent of the 19th century literary salons. I remember well one cool spring day, May 30th, going to the writer's hideaway village of Paradelkino, where scores of Muscovites, young and old, were making their annual pilgrimage to the grave of Boris Pasternak. One of the peculiar aspects of the Soviet system is that a man like Pasternak can be quoted, cited, and honored as a poet because the regime finds it convenient to number such a famous lyrical writer within its official family. But the inconvenient half of Pasternak, the free spirit who wrote Dr. Zhivago, is simply denied any public existence. Tourists, when they ask about visiting his grave, are always given excuses about why that is impossible. Yet so tranquil was the scene in Paradelkino that day that the ugly campaign against Pasternak over Zhivago and the Nobel Prize that he was forced to decline seemed only a distant memory. A cool breeze wafted through the three tall pines and the cove of birches that shelter his grave. Small boys were playing on piles of prefabricated slabs of concrete left out in the open, and barefoot countrywomen were quietly spading the rich chocolate earth near the graveyard. A huge black crow paused to peck in the freshly furrowed field. On the white tombstone, designed by Pasternak's friend, the sculptress Sarah Lebedeva, people quietly laid their unpretentious bouquets, tulips, buttercups, hand-picked lilies of the valley, even dandelions. The tombstone, handsome in its stark simplicity, bore the clean, pure, indented impression of the poet's craggy head, and the simple legend, Boris Pasternak, 1890 through 1960. The family had provided a miscellaneous assortment of water-filled jars for the overflow of flowers. "There are not enough jars," a family friend gently chided Alyona Pasternak, the writer's daughter-in-law. "Not to worry," she replied. "Usually there are mountains of flowers on the grave." Those who came ranged from elderly women in baggy coats and thick gray socks that Russian matrons prefer in the colder months, to modish young women in zipper-pocketed jeans, or young men carrying attache cases or wearing western-cut raincoats. All had reached Paradelkino by the suburban Elektrika train from Moscow and had walked nearly a mile to the grave. Pasternak's admirers began coming to the grave in mid-morning, and their gentle procession stretched into the evening. They would lay down their flowers and stand for a few moments in the rectangle of pilgrims around the grave, until they saw that newcomers needed their places. At one point while we were there, a youth who wore a wreath of dandelions recited what was apparently his own poetry in praise of Pasternak and encouraged others to follow suit. Most preferred silence. A few hours later, another group, some of them professional writers, read Pasternak's poetry, including verses from Dr. Zhivago. I wandered into the neighboring graveyard, which had for decades been reserved for old Bolsheviks. One reason why there had been controversy over Pasternak's being buried there. Each tombstone bore not only the normal dates of birth and death, but the loyal record of when each person had joined the Communist Party. When I observed to one of Pasternak's relatives that Pasternak and the old Bolsheviks made strange bedfellows, he smilingly commented, "Pasternak was the old Bolsheviks' link with the people." The writer's grave and that of his wife nearby looked down a gentle slope across a broad meadow, already plowed and planted that spring to the rambling old wooden dacha where Pasternak lived out his final years. There his sons Zhenya and Leonid gathered with their friends in the evening, while modern writers like Vozninsky and Yevtushenko, Akasyanov, and many others came to pay their tribute and to read richly from the Pasternak that is still partly forbidden, in a society where the state ritually causes millions to mark so many anniversaries and holidays for its own political ends. This seemed all the more meaningful an occasion because it had been forgotten by the state and remembered by private individuals. I recall another such gathering at the home of the late Korny, Tchaikovsky, a brilliant and much-loved children's writer, where the level of the discourse, the spontaneous dramatic readings, the recited poetry, and the ad-lib humor was refreshingly free of the cant and hypocrisy of the tortured mainstream of public culture and the rancid bitterness that is so often its private echo. There was nothing counter-revolutionary in what was said, but one sensed a pure and honest communality. The Russian intelligentsia in its natural setting, the company itself was interesting, perhaps because Tchaikovsky in his lifetime had ranged so broadly. Not only had he been the genial author of wonderful children's stories, as well known to Russians as Hans Christian Andersen to the rest of the world, but early in life he had been the charming but sharp-witted enfant terrible among the literary critics during the luminous flowering of the Silver Age of Russian culture a few years before World War I. Tolstoy, Blok, Gorky, Bunin, Shyapin, Mayakovsky had peopled his life and scribbled whimsy and irreverences in a marvelous album he kept through his life. The censors have not yet seen fit to permit the album to be published, even posthumously. Late in life, in the Khrushchev-Brezhnev years, Tchaikovsky defended younger liberal writers from Akasyanov and Alexander Galek to Solzhenitsyn when they had come under fire from conservatives. On that day his daughter, Lydia Koronyevanina, an important writer in her own right, had assembled an unusual company. Lev Kopelev, a scholar of Russian and German culture, who as an army officer had objected to looting and raping by Soviet troops in Germany, and for that had been sent to the camps for 10 years, where he met Solzhenitsyn and became a model for Rubin, one of the characters in First Circle. His wife, Riza Orlova, a warm and talented literary critic and specialist in American literature. Veniamin Kavarin, a writer who had been a leader in the Serapion Brothers movement of the 20s, attempting to free literature from all political and social commitment. Volodya Kornilov, a middle-aged poet and writer, husky and bearded as Hemingway. Natalia Ilyina, a prominent and very able satirical writer and journalist. Rina Zeleniana, a popular and delightfully amusing television actress. Clara Lozovsky, Tchaikovsky's devoted secretary, who developed and maintained the museum which his house had become, despite the lack of customary assistance from the state, and two younger linguists and critics, Eric Kanapira and Vladimir Glotster. The three generations present were the physical embodiment of the transfer of culture from past to future. It was a damp, cold day, October 28th. The little hillside cemetery near the Perodolinkino church, where Tchaikovsky was buried not far from Pasternak and the old Bolsheviks, was a sea of coffee-colored mud, and we slithered around the pathways, clinging to the fence posts to keep from sliding downhill. It was the kind of day on which he died, someone whispered to me, but unbowed and straight-backed. Lydia Tchaikovskaya stood by the grave, tall, white-haired, and erect, like some New England Calvinist heroine. Of her, another writer remarked, "When there is a flood in the countryside, there is usually a stick which stands upright in the stream and shows the level of the flood. Lydia Koronievna is like that, always the same, rigid, uncompromising, and for that unbending independence, her novels published in the West about the Stalinist period, her public defense of dissident physicist Andrei Sakharov when he was under severe attack in the fall of '73, and her giving shelter to Zelensky in his final months in the Soviet Union. She was expelled from the Writers' Union in '74. After the penetrating dampness of the brief cemetery vigil, the warmth of Tchaikovsky's home museum was a welcome relief. A huge, well-filled table had been set for 20 or more, and people plopped unceremoniously on an odd assortment of chairs, sofas padded with extra pillows and stools. The Russians did not mind. It was company and conversation that mattered. Lydia Tchaikovskaya determined that the remembrance should be not only for the man, but more significantly for a cultured spirit, and an era of cultural elegance had arranged for some readings. One was an amusing yet taut and telling essay by Tchaikovsky written in 1910 about several writers of the period, another done in 1911 by the writer Vasily Rozanov, graphically depicted Tchaikovsky's charm as a lecturer, and then fiercely debated his highbrow contention that the mass media, especially the movies, were a corrupting influence that would cheapen culture. With a capital C, Rozanov accused Tchaikovsky of being too far removed from the masses. The two readings were a catalyst around the table for feverish discussion of well-remembered elements of Russian cultural life in the Silver Age. I could not follow it all, but clearly everyone had been stimulated by the richness of the essayist's linguistic styles and the openness of the debate 6 decades earlier. One by one, the writers around the table were coaxed into giving their own remarks, readings, and performances for the others. Toasts were raised, and the generous portion of food surrendered to the common appetite. Rina Zelenaya, a little wag of a woman with a hoarse voice, rolling eyes, and a plastic face that made her imitations of children on television a delight to all, gave a puckish parody of Soviet propaganda. She had come armed with a book of her own stories, including one satirizing the cult of hero workers in the Soviet press. Her story was about a small boy who had helped his grandmother wash the dishes once. When this became known at his Young Pioneers camp, he was promptly asked to give a speech to the camp. How I helped grandmother wash the dishes. Soon he was written up in the camp newspaper and then his school newspaper. His school was then deluged with letters from children in other cities asking him how dishes are washed and how one is most helpful to grandmother, all of which Rina Zelnaya read with a wonderful mixture of slurs, lisps, burps, mock seriousness, and the gawkish awkwardness of a 9-year-old, her eyes rolling and a hand on her hip. the elbow stuck jauntily outward. By that time the company had made a substantial dent in the vodka as well as the food, and people were laughing so hard at her performance that some found it hard to breathe. But the Little Hero campaign rolled onward. The boy himself was asked to write testimonials about dishwashing for other schools, to post on their bulletin boards, and to print in their newspapers. His life became one great testimonial. Finally, one evening, the grandmother asked him to help her wash the dishes once more, but the young hero could not. He was so busy writing letters to others about how to wash dishes and how to help grandmother that he had no time to do it any more himself. Of all the self-appointed carriers of culture, Nadezhda Mandelstam personifies most clearly the living conduit of knowledge that is officially dead. Her frail husband, Osip Mandelstam, perhaps the greatest Russian poet of the century, paid with his life for a 14-line poem that mocked Stalin as the Kremlin mountaineer, the murderer with a cockroach whiskers leer, and fingers fat as grubs. Mandelstam vanished in the Stalinist camps, dead roughly in 1938. No one has pinpointed the date. In 1973, delayed by censors for 13 years, a collection of some of his poetry was published and marketed almost entirely abroad, in callous disregard of the hunger for Mandelstam's work among his own people. The volume was bereft, not surprisingly, of his most trenchant verses, those either too virile or too tragic for Soviet censors. Those poems have appeared only in the West, thanks to his widow's tenacious efforts to ensure that the legacy did not perish. Like a hunted rabbit, as Joseph Brodsky put it, she dodged about the country for years after his death, avoiding arrest and preserving the treasure of Mandelstam's poetry by scattering it among friends for safekeeping and memorizing practically every line, thus making herself a living archive. "If you get me started," she said to me once, "I can recite for 3 hours without stopping." It would have been impossible that afternoon, for Nadezhda Yakovlevna, as her Russian friends called her, was rasping and coughing from a variety of ailments, aggravated, I am sure, by the pungent tobacco of the strong, foul-smelling Russian papirosi, the tube cigarettes to which she was addicted in spite of her ulcer and her 72 years. She would puff and cough, puff out one vile tube and light another, twisting its hollow stem, Russian style, for a filter. But judging from her coughing, it did not filter much. Sometimes she looked as pale as ancient as death, but in fact she was as unquenchable as life itself, short, sturdy, tough as women have to be, she herself liked to boast. Nadezhda Yakovlevna was also flattered by anything that allowed her to play the role of poet's widow, and to recall her anguished but halcyon martyrdom with her beloved Osip. One evening I remember how a pilgrimage to her apartment by Jan Meyer, a Slavic specialist from the University of Utrecht, prompted her to rattle off from memory, and later, aided by dossiers secreted under her bed, 10 variations of one of Mandelstam's longer poems, while Meyer scribbled away furiously, and I held her wobbly, porcelain-topped kitchen table steady for him to write upon. Young Russian intellectuals hovered around her like acolytes, attending to her housekeeping, while she preached or lectured as long as energy held out. She would either lie on her side in bed while an ailing leg kept her from getting up, or, wrapped in a faded green housecoat, would sit on the high-backed settee that occupied half of her tiny kitchen. Her one-bedroom living room was absolutely crammed with a disorderly clutter of books, icons, records, paintings, furniture, more books than furniture, and dried flowers, brought to her long ago by admiring friends, and evidently too precious a remembrance of them or of nature to be thrown away. It was impossible for more than 3 or 4 people to gather around her without someone knocking over a vase of dried flowers. In such a setting, she would open up an entire universe to her listeners, with her vivid recollections not only of Mandelstam, but of legendary Russian poets like Akhmatova, Tsvetayeva, Pasternak, and Belly, or writers like Bulgakov, Zoshchenko, Platonov, or Plnak, an entire constellation of Russian culture for half a century, all of whom she had known personally. More than anything, she relished a chance to have others confirm her husband's preeminent place in the firmament, but not cheaply. One of her favorite intellectual sports was to challenge someone else to come up with a great intellectual figure, or a writer from anywhere in the world, in order to undercut the candidate and reassure herself that no one was a match for Mandelstam, and to reaffirm her own judgment that not only Russian culture but world culture was irreversibly in decline. Her own vinegary judgments of art and people were rendered as unsparingly as by the Old Testament Jehovah. In the incestuous world of the Moscow intelligentsia, where important writers not only know each other, but are often related or married to each other's former wives. Or husbands. This trait turned many old friends away from her permanently when her naked verdicts appeared in her 2 remarkable books, Hope Against Hope and Hope Abandoned. Especially after the second book was published in the West, we knew several free-spirited intellectuals who so resented her having dismissed people as weak-willed toadies, informers, or the like, that they would no longer join her coterie or visit her apartment. Some were embittered that she had criticized others from the relative safety of her world prominence, while other people, less well known and hence more vulnerable, could not afford to speak out candidly in reply without jeopardizing themselves or giving ammunition to the authorities against her, which they were both to do. Perhaps her tartness was a sign of age. Once, when I was talking with Nadezhda Yakovlevna about the problem of being Jewish in the Soviet Union, the discussion touched the late Ilya Ehrenberg, whose famous novel, The Thaw, lent its name to the period of Khrushchevian cultural liberalism of the late 50s and early 60s. I recalled Ehrenberg's remark that it is impossible not to feel Jewish when there is anti-Semitism in one's homeland. That's the only good thing he said. Nadezhda Yakovlevna declared, the acidity of her comment surprised me not only because Ehrenberg had been a lifelong friend of the Mandelstams, but also because he had presided in '65 at a rare evening in Osip Mandelstam's honor. I suggested that for foreigners, Ehrenberg was a more complex figure, but she came back quickly. His specialty was deceiving foreigners. She meant deceiving them into thinking that he was more liberal than in fact he was, which is still a much practiced technique of writers, journalists, scientists, and intellectuals interested in ingratiating themselves with Westerners. When I asked her by whom we were being deceived now, unhesitatingly she replied, "You are now being deceived by Yevtushenko and Voznesensky." Equally harsh was she in her judgment of the Western world, whose literature she knew fairly well, for she had read widely in English, French, and German, and had talked with a number of Western scholars and writers who had visited the Soviet Union. In her estimation, T.S. Eliot was a great poet, and William Faulkner a great prose writer. She admired them both for their Christian beliefs as well as their art, for Christianity was a vital matter to her. Tell me a great American writer, since Faulkner, she would demand. Saul Bellow she found tedious. Nabokov was only a craftsman. W. H. Auden and Robert Lowell were not on a par with the greats. Hemingway was shallow. F. Scott Fitzgerald she felt was better because he captured the spirit of an age and he loved America. Although Nadezhda Yakovlevna had the tensile strength of steel, and the authorities had not harassed her in recent years, treating her as a non-person. The fear that followed her for years after her husband's arrest in May of '34 still haunted her. One evening when Anne and I were alone with her, she was constantly phoning friends, talking to each for only a couple of minutes, like a blind person reaching for the walls in a room, seeking the reassurance of contact with some known point on the compass. The apartment searches and the interrogations of other intellectuals, particularly pronounced in '72 and '73, during the secret police crackdown against the unofficial Chronicle of Current Events, worried her greatly. "I'm always shivering in the evening, but after half an hour I'll stop," she said, rather clinically. I glanced at my watch. It was 8:30. "After 9 they don't come," she advised. "They are not allowed to come after that." Why she thought that the secret police had a 9 o'clock curfew, I don't know, but she was then as convinced of that as she had been earlier that they would get her before she could write Mandelstam's story and get it out to the West to be published. I was greatly afraid when I was writing both my books, but I kept going, she said. I had to. There was nothing else to do. It was my duty to my husband. Americans, she protested, had no idea how others lived, especially Russians. She had heard from the poet Robert Lowell, who had read Hope Against Hope, and remarked, in response to her searing description of the hell of informing, repressions, interrogations, suspicions, midnight arrests, and oppressive fear of the Stalinist era, that things were much the same everywhere. Evidently, in some effort to console her, "You Americans are wonderful liars," she growled with a knowing smile. At the time when the exodus of Soviet Jewish intellectuals to Israel and the West was at its peak in '72 and '73, Nadezhda Yakovlevna liked to tease herself and others with the notion of going into exile, but she was far too deeply rooted in Russia, too deeply devoted to her task of passing on to the younger generation what she knew of the past, for anyone to take seriously her threatened departure. What her one wished for many years was to be sure that the complete collection of Mandelstam's papers would finally find some safe repository, preferably abroad, with some Western scholar whom she could trust. That accomplished, she told a friend, then I could die in peace. So it was arranged for a young American to help convey them out of the country. Nadezhda Yakovlevna had not dared keep them all in her own apartment because she feared a raid by the secret police. They were farmed out to the most trusted young scholars and students, so she had them assembled, perhaps 25 pounds of papers in all, and when they were all at her place, word was passed indirectly to the American to come take them. A day or two later he arrived, and Nadezhda Yakovlevna, who never had patience for trivia, went right to the business. "You've come," she said, lying in her bed. "I had them all here, but I have sent them away," her large brown eyes searching for a reaction, the creases in her full masculine head deeper than ever, her wispy hair neatened but not combed, showed how much she had been tested by the decision. To part with that lifeblood legacy was as anguishing for her as to part from Russia itself. "Do you despise me for being so two-minded?" she asked the young man in the characteristic uncompromising biblical way of hers. He shook his head. "I couldn't do it," she said. This living vessel of Russian culture, these young people love them. You see, there is always Russia." And regardless of risk, that was where she felt they belonged. It is hard to imagine two individuals more different than Nadezhda. Mandelstam and George Kostakis, the Russian-born Greek who had assembled what must be the world's foremost collection of the brilliant painting of the first Russian avant-garde, that was so firmly suppressed in the 20s, where she is bold and blasphemous, brazenly confronting power. Kostakis has been cautious and calculating, defensive and diplomatic, courting power and seeking to beguile it. But like her, he is an important atoll in the uncharted archipelago of private culture, for he has managed to accumulate an enormous load of Russia's forgotten cultural wealth, and to preserve it when the natural ravages of an antagonistic system would have destroyed it. By all the logic of Soviet socialist realism today, George Kostakis and his private art collection should not exist. It is a measure of the idiosyncrasies of the Soviet system, which permits in private what it censors in public, that one can step into the ample, well-appointed 7-room apartment of Kostakis and be transported to a world utterly beyond the boundaries of the stodgy, placard world of official Soviet art. Not once, but several times, Anne and I went there, and on each occasion we were overwhelmed from the instant we entered by the fireworks of modern art, dazzling in a country which had so little aesthetic beauty and color in its public life. The apartment is literally ablaze with the colors of nearly 300 works of Kazimir Malevich, Vasily Kandinsky, Marc Chagall, Vladimir Tatlin, Lyubov Popova, Ivan Kiliment Retiko, Alexander Rodanchenko, and many others in every room, on every wall, in almost every inch of space. Here, an entire wall of Chagall blue fantasies and fairy tale country figures in lyrical woodcut style. There, 9 Kandinskys, including the well-known psychedelic abstraction of Red Square opposite a large and pivotal canvas by Malevich at the juncture when he was leaving Cubism to create his new geometrical suprematism and to chart a new course for art. Very few people, Russian or foreigners, are aware of the multi-million-dollar collection of Russian suprematism, constructivism, Cubism, and abstract modernism that the 63-year-old Greek has assembled, but such art experts as Princeton's Frederick Starr compare its impact to that of the famous Armory Show in New York in 1913, which first opened American eyes to new trends in European art. What is interesting for foreigners when they see my collection, Kostakis remarked, is that they find that in some paintings the Russians were 30, 40, 50 years in advance. Something that was done in Russia in 1917, 18, and 19 was done in America in the 50s and 60s. Not only are foreigners amazed, so is Kostakis. I remember one wintry afternoon, as he was showing around a group of people from Western embassies, Kostakis recalled his own joy of discovery at his first glimpse of a single-stripe white and green abstraction by Olga Rozanova, done in 1917. "My heart was beating wildly," he said. "It was like finding a rocket ship built in 1917 and stored in someone's shed. Impossible, because they were just making such a rocket ship 10 or 15 years ago, but there are the markings. It was really done in 1917. The suprematist designs of Kalyan, with circles superimposed on geometric shapes and layers of translucent color passing through each other, foreshadowed, in Kostakis' view, some experimentation by American artists 40 years later. Over a bed he has hung a painting of Drips and Splashes by Rodchenko, which he feels predated Jackson Pollock's first such ventures. Don't think I am putting Russian art way up here and American art way down there," Kostakis said, raising one sturdy hand over his head and pushing the other down to his knee, "because today the most important art, the most interesting things, are being done in America, but it happened, you see, that some things were done in Russia first." Physically, George Kostakis seems an unlikely man to collect dazzling modern art. If one had a palette, the instinct would be to paint him in subdued browns and olives, catching the weight of his shoulders, his dark hair, his drooping eyes, his heavy hands. As a person, too, he is an unusual combination, blended with his passion for bright, unconventional art. I sensed not only the natural instincts of a collector, wealth inherited from his father's prosperous tobacco business, a keen Greek mercantile eye for value, and the special status of a foreigner who since 1943 has worked for the Canadian Embassy, enjoying protection that Russians do not have, but also the inbred conservative canniness of a ward politician who has studied the prevailing political winds and ferreted out allies within the establishment to help him navigate the shoals. Paradoxically, Kostakis' passion for art was born about the time that Kandinsky and Chagall fled west as the avant-garde was being snuffed out in the mid-20s. As a lad of 13, he became a choir boy at the Orthodox Church on Pushkin Square, where the great Chailepin occasionally sang. "Sometimes I would not have time to get home, and I would sleep at church on the robes of the priest," he said. "The robes, the icons, and the paintings were very beautiful. They gave me a taste for art." His collector's instinct got its boost about the same time. His brother-in-law, a member of the aristocratic Greek Metaxas family, had a set of rare stamps which he left to his widow. No one appreciated their value, and they were given to young George, who raced off to sell them to get money toward a bicycle. He was astonished when a Japanese tourist outside the stamp store gave me all the money in his wallet, enough for 6 bicycles. By the time he was 22, Kostakis was seriously collecting antiques, old Russian silver, and paintings by traditional French and Dutch masters. In the pre-war period, as the families of the old Tsarist nobility, deprived of their fortunes, sold off their artworks, Moscow was full of treasures at bargain prices. The sea change in Kostakis' life came after World War II, when traditional art began to pall. "Little by little, I got tired of all the grays and browns," he explained. "One afternoon, over very strong black coffee, I wanted some color around me. Bright modern art is like medicine for me. If I feel bad, I can come into the room, sit surrounded by it, and it cures me. Also, I wanted to do something new. I knew that anyone could collect Dutch masters. I thought to myself, the Louvre is full and every city has 4 or 5 museums of classical art. I had always wanted to do something, write a book, invent a machine. Then, accidentally, I came across 2 or 3 avant-garde paintings. To me, they were dynamic and colorful. I got them for nothing. I put them with my other paintings, and it was as if I had been living in a dark room, and suddenly the sun came in. Not only was he unusual and daring, but lucky. That was the era when Stalin's henchman, Andrei Zadornov, was vigorously stamping out formalism and liberalism in the arts. Stupid Greek collecting junk is what Kostakis recalled other collectors saying about him then. Like a detective, he began to track down the art of avant-garde. Some paintings came from widows and families of artists. Others, like his favorites of Olga Rozanova, were given to him by collectors who had no use for abstract art. Rodchenko had done 6 modernistic mobiles, but out of fear of discovery under Stalin destroyed 5. The 6th survived, collapsed, and hidden on top of a wardrobe, and Kostakis retrieved it. A Popova abstraction painted on plywood hung for years in a barn. Another painting was under oilcloth on someone's kitchen table, either hidden in ignorance or deliberately secreted. When Kostakis had to pay, he bought at tremendous bargains. A big Malevich Cubist suprematist work, now worth probably 1.5 million, cost him roughly 400. He paid the same for a lovely Chagall still life, lilacs on a table, and half that much for a Cubist work by Popova. Those were years, he explained, when names like Kandinsky and Chagall were known, but not fully appreciated, and when he himself was branching out from what he likes to call the marshals and generals of the Russian avant-garde to find the colonels, the captains, and the privates. In all, he estimated that about 300 painters took part in the avant-garde movement from 1910 to 25, and about 40 are in his collection. To Western eyes, there is nothing politically incendiary in this art, with one exception, unorthodox. The exception, a striking one, is a prophetic Kafkaesque canvas called Uprising, done by Clement Retiko at the time of Lenin's death in 24. Chillingly, it conveys the Red Terror and the regimentation of Stalinist totalitarianism to come and the Civil War just past. Like a political icon, it sets out the main figures of the revolution, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, Bukharin, and others, in a diamond pattern against a blood-red background. Around this centerpiece move somber funeral bands and truckloads of troops shooting defenseless people in the streets. In the rest of the collection, however, the only visible political sentiment, if any, is the exuberant idealism of the artist of the revolutionary period. Still, the collection hangs in a peculiarly Soviet kind of limbo. The art itself remains taboo, yet discreetly and without official interference, Kostakis has shown it to foreigners, from resident diplomats to art scholars and such distinguished visitors as Marc Chagall, Nina Kandinsky, David Rockefeller, Avril Hermann, and former French Premier Edgar Faure. More gingerly yet, he has opened this rich heritage to select groups of Russians. As many as 90 at a time have come from the Moscow Institute of Architecture, Pushkin Museum, Tretyakov Gallery, or the Russian Museum in Leningrad. Kostakis, who is careful not to mix foreigners and Russians in his private showings, thrives on giving guided tours, explaining the art, or softly playing a melancholy guitar while his blonde wife, Zina, sings old Russian romances. In June of '72, he loaned 27 cubist and abstract paintings by Kylan and Popova to senior scientists at the Kurchatov Institute of Physics, who were interested in modern art. On another occasion, he organized a similar closed exposition of work by Mikhail Leonov at the Institute. His patient goal has been to gain recognition for the avant-garde art, first abroad and then through Western influence. In Moscow, in '59, he got his first break when sympathetic officials in the Ministry of Culture helped him send 5 paintings to a Chagall exhibition in West Germany. Since then, other small groups of his paintings have been loaned briefly to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, Tate Gallery in London, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and galleries in Japan, Italy, Germany, and elsewhere, but Soviet authorities have always rejected requests for a loan of the entire collection. Some Soviet officials, including the late Minister of Culture, Yekaterina Firsteva, his secret patron, have been flattered that his showings abroad and to limited circles in Moscow have helped publicize Russian artistic achievements in a way that had added to Soviet prestige in the West without challenging official canons of art at home. In return, Kostakis has been allowed to sell off some lesser works of modern painters and possibly part of his magnificent and valuable collection of classic religious icons. As part of an obvious accommodation with some authorities, he has played the politics of art with careful conservatism in recent years. In the late '50s and early '60s, he used to collect the works of the contemporary unofficial artists like Oscar Robin, Dmitry Plavinsky, and Vasily Sitnikov. Curious Westerners in that period often had Kostakis as a guide, leading them to the subterranean world of nonconformist artists. But as his semi-official stature grew, Kostakis broke with those artists and sold off many of their paintings. When in September of '74 they boldly attempted to hold their outdoor art exhibits, Kostakis was privately alarmed by their tactics of confrontation, fearing that they would jeopardize his world. That is not the way to help art, he complained. For a time he stopped allowing Russians to see his own collection until the scandal blew over. He became defensive, too, about Western contentions that the Soviets killed the avant-garde movement with political suppression. That is not true, he asserted to a group one afternoon, somewhat inconsistently with his own tales of the difficulties of finding the hidden art. The avant-garde sent paintings abroad. They exhibited here. They had freedom, but people did not understand their art. Nobody recognized them or appreciated them. Everywhere, in England, in America, in France, people lost interest in avant-garde art. Cubism was accepted, so was Fauvism, but not avant-garde. Only in the last 10 or 15 years has it come back. His ardent advocacy of Russian artistic achievement and his deliberate effort to avoid offending the authorities have helped him win some official favor. Madame Firsteva, when she was alive, led Kostakis to believe that when the new Treteyakov gallery opened in '77, some of his works might be displayed there. Whether or not she could have won the necessary approval of the party leadership, her death has raised new uncertainties. As a final hope, Kostakis has talked of some arrangement permitting him to keep and sell off a small portion of his paintings as an inheritance for his family. If he were to bequeath the rest to Russia, "I don't want this collection to be destroyed," he said to me one afternoon with the earnest concern of a man growing old and caught in a delicate dilemma. "When the Russians are ready to recognize this art, I will give it to the state." Although lowbrow in comparison with the Kostakis collection, a medium with far wider impact in the private world of the intelligentsia is music, the music of the underground balladeers. Circulating unpublishable writing in Russia is as old as Pushkin, who did it 150 years ago, when the Tsar and his censors blocked the publication of some of his poetry. The Russians called it samizdat, literally self-publishing. The advent of the electronic age, with its handy portable cassette recordings, has revolutionized samizdat and made the job of ideological watchdogs infinitely more complicated. A writer or humorist with a guitar can sing some amusing, politically off-color songs to friends at a small party, and if someone has brought along a tape or cassette recorder, which the Russians call a magnetophone, the process of uncensored reproduction begins at once, and its outward ripples continue endlessly. Wryly, the Russians call this magnetizdat, magnetic self-publishing. Through that medium, the modern outlaw minstrels of Soviet society have developed an audience of millions. Not only the young and disgruntled intelligentsia, but technocrats and even government and party officials, all clandestine admirers. Since about 1960, when magnetizdat got its start, as Khrushchev was letting people out of the Stalinist camps, a couple of dozen balladeers have become known. Of these, by far the best-known figures of the underworld of music are Bulot Okudovzava, Vladimir Vysovsky, and Alexander Galek. Okudovzava is a well-established liberal poet and writer now in his early 40s. His Gulp of Freedom is a funny, bawdy, and highly unconventional historical novel about the 19th century Russian revolutionaries known as the Decembrists, presenting them not as a band of fearless heroes in the stereotype of Soviet propaganda, but as a confused and beaten lot. However admirable their democratic impulses, his underground songs have a similar lyrical mood of melancholy alienation. As a war veteran who was wounded, Okudovzava has many songs about the cruel and aimless brutality of war, decidedly at odds with official panegyrics. Don't believe in war, little boy goes one. It is sad, little boy, and as tight as boots. Your dashing steed can accomplish nothing, and you will wind up getting all the bullets. Several times, Okudovzava was called down by the ideologist for his uncivic ballads, but he continued to compose them until in June of '72 he was expelled from the Communist Party for anti-party behavior and refusal to condemn the publication of some of his works abroad. Since then, he has been less active. The most popular of the balladeers by far is Vysovsky, a jaunty, sandy-haired, nationally famous movie star and actor at Moscow's liberal Taganka Theater, where I saw him perform several times. Vysovsky, who is married to French film star Marina Vladi, has become something of an idol to all young people. In his youth, he did a stretch in a penal camp, got out during the Khrushchev period, and made his peace with the regime by playing movie roles calculated to inspire idealistic Soviet youth. Mountain climbers, geologists, or patriots headed off to conquer Siberia. On television or at the Taganka, Vysovsky, now in his early 40s, has gained status playing Hamlet, the lead role in Brecht's Galileo, and Pashurin in Lermontov's classic Hero of Our Time. Deftly, Vysovsky has plied an ambivalent course His 5 officially released records include wholesome Soviet tunes about alpinists, friendship, space heroes, and the war dead. Even his unofficial repertoire is sprinkled with humorous tunes mocking Bobby Fischer, the rough play of Canadian hockey pros, or Chairman Mao, all themes with a healthy dollop of patriotism that he can use at concerts and an army of young Soviet guitarists can play safely on the streets. The more private his audience, especially if it is a group of actors drinking into the wee hours after a show, the more risks he takes. One writer raved to me about a Vysotsky routine apping the clumsy ungrammatical talk of a factory director, an act with calculated appeal for the Moscow intelligentsia, who look down their noses at our peasant bosses. Rarely does he go that far in song, however. One Vysotsky tune playing on the inequality of sounds on the musical scale pokes fun at the rank consciousness of Soviet officialdom. Another, the Ballad of the Currency Store, mocks the cultural elite trooping off to specialty stores to buy carpets, fur coats, and caviar with special certificates, which ordinary rubles cannot buy. Yet another, named for a mythical Seryavka foeman, lampoons officials who sat out World War II on the home front, awarding themselves the nation's highest decorations. While I shed my blood for the country and for home, something always burned me up inside. I was bleeding for Seryavka foeman, while he sat back and did not risk his hide. At last the war was over, the heavy burden from our shoulders passed. I met Seryavka foeman, low hero of the Soviet Union, on his breast. Vysotsky has many tunes about the miseries of prison camp life, the fate of penal battalions in the war, and one daring song of the madhouse, telling of the trauma of a sane man put in a mental hospital where real lunatics menace him. And if Gogol could be told about our life in grief, even Gogol would gaze on it in utter disbelief. But Vysotsky, a slick performer with a knack for suggestive innuendo, leaves it unclear whether the prisoners have landed in the penal camps or the mental hospital for political crimes or something less subversive, and this takes the sting out of many of his songs. Like Akadzaeva, he has been publicly chastised, bawled out for profiteering, in 1973 by giving 16 concerts in 4 days in the city of Novokazansk, when the legal limit is 1 a day, and barred from traveling to France to see or accompany his wife, but ever agile, he has always managed to bounce back, protected in part by his massive following and his loyal ballads. He is clever, observed a woman journalist. Vysotsky makes it because he knows the limits. The KGB themselves collect his songs. They know all those camp tunes of his. They like the jargon of thieves that he uses. They are thieves themselves. Vysotsky knows you can criticize different things here and there, but you can't criticize the system, the party, and you can never touch them, the bosses, personally. His songs aren't political. That is what finished Galek. Unlike Vysotsky, Alexander Galek, who is from an older generation, did not spend time in the camps, but for 30 years was a successful writer before disillusionment and a sense of guilt moved him into the ranks of the underground balladeers. He is the only one I heard and came to know personally, and he is by far the most barbed in his satire, the most desolate in his view of Soviet society, and the most daring in theme. Born in 1918, he was trained as an actor in the Stanislavski School and later became a successful dramatist. 10 of his plays and several screenplays described by official Soviet publications as dealing with the romance of the struggle and creative labor of Soviet youth were performed before he fell out of favor. Though a handful of his best scripts did not make it past the censor, the sharp edge of moral dissent in his underground ballads later earned him the nickname as the Tselentsin of song. With a receding hairline and a prominent moustache, Gallic looks like a stouter, taller, sadder Xavier Cugat, hunched over his little guitar, and singing in a light, unmusical bass, he can transform a smoke-filled apartment jammed with sweating people into a political cabaret. First, I have a housekeeping matter, he'll begin. If anybody telephones me, please ask them to call back in an hour or half an hour, or hour and a half. The obvious allusion to telling the KGB to wait while Gallic sings his political songs gets a laugh. Then, deadpan and sardonic, he launches into the Ballad of the Clean Hands, mocking the political lot of the Soviet citizen as the obligation to chew, to moo, and to listen, while campfires burn in the Siberian labor camps and Soviet armored trains stand near Prague. Gallic pictures Russians repeating their school grammar lessons. I wash my hands, you wash your hands, he washes his hands. So minimal is Gallic's guitar playing that it often comes across as a musical prop for a raconteur whose tales turn on masterful parody of the bureaucratic language of public life, historical allusions, and the argot of the underworld. To drive home an image, Gallic will come up with grotesque combinations like casting Stalin and Herod in the story of the Nativity, or forcing Johann Sebastian Bach as the symbol of creative individual to endure the daily grind of Soviet life. He has sung movingly about anti-Semitism in Warsaw and trains leaving for Auschwitz or prisoners off in the Stalinist camps. But where Gallic was most daring and most different from the others was in singing not only about the oppressed little people of Soviet society, but their high and mighty oppressors, challenging the contemporary generation of leaders. In several tunes he suggested that the Stalinist mood is not dead, and that hangmen are nostalgic for the old days. One eerie vocal fantasy, Night Patrol, imagines a monument of Stalin and thousands of other statues coming back to life in the dark of night and stalking the sleeping city while drums roll. Another characteristic Gallic lyric takes aim at successful careerists who made their way to the top by silently riding with the tide. Let others cry out from despair, from insult, from hunger and cold. In silence we know there's more profit, and the reason is silence is gold. That's how you get to be wealthy, that's how you get to be first, that's how you get to be hangman. Just keep mum, keep mum, keep mum. Gallic has peopled his repertoire of more than 100 underground tunes with several stock Soviet characters. On the night that I heard him, people were calling for songs about Klim Petrovich Kolomestev, workshop foreman, holder of many decorations, and deputy of the city Soviet. In one ballad, Klim Petrovich goes to plead with higher officials for proper recognition of the outstanding performance of his factory in fulfilling all economic plans up to 1980, but they beg off, saying it would be too embarrassing to make a public commendation. The West would raise a fuss because the plant produces barbed wire. And another Klim Petrovich escapade that delights Russians is a lovely lampoon on the canned propaganda lectures everyone is called upon to make at various meetings. In the Gallic rendition, Klim Petrovich is handed a prepared text, mistakenly meant for a woman, but gamely delivers it unknowingly. The Israeli militarists, I say, are well known to the whole world. As a mother, I say, and as a woman, I demand they be brought to answer. Astonished, Klem Petrovich checks the audience and the party officials as he rolls on verse after verse of this feminist appeal, but he finds everyone too numbed from so many lectures to notice the mistake. Afterwards, the party secretary praises him. You gave it to him good, like a worker. Surprisingly, given his daring, Gallic has one mass public concert, only one, in early 1968 at the House of Scientists in Novosibirsk's academic city, then a haven of liberalism, where 2,500 people heard him sing for 3 hours or more. His song in tribute to Pasternak, his political tunes about Stalinism, and his adventures of Klem Petrovich were enthusiastically received, he told me, but later he said he was summoned by the heads of the Writers' Union and forbidden to make more appearances. Well, no one forbade me, he smiled. You know their hypocritical way. We don't recommend it. You have a bad heart, dear boy. No need to strain yourself. Gallic's downfall came, however, in December of 71 at a private party where he was not even singing. According to Gallic, Vysotsky was singing Gallic's songs at the wedding party of a young actor, Ivan Diakovichny, who had married Olga Polyansky, the blonde daughter of Dmitry Polyansky, a member of the Politburo. Polyansky, who has a very conservative reputation, was said to have chuckled at some of Vysotsky's own lighter tunes, but to have been outraged at Gallic's sharp satires. Surprisingly, Polyansky's son, a naval officer, tried to offer a defense by saying that these songs were not that unusual, that they were sung even by Navy officers, but that only enraged Polyansky more. According to Gallic, Polyansky telephoned that very night to Pyotr Dmitrichev, the party's chief watchdog over cultural affairs, and within 10 days, on December 29th, Gallic was expelled from the Writers' Union on the pretext that he was propagating Zionism, encouraging people to immigrate to Israel, and refusing to renounce the publication of his songs in the West. He lost his rights as a film writer, too. Some of his films were withdrawn and his credits were removed from others. Not only am I untouchable, but I am unmentionable, Gallic later protested. He was left without work to live on a 60 ruble a month state disability pension granted on the grounds of his several heart attacks. In early 74, finding the blacklisting unbearable, Gallic applied for a visa to visit a cousin in New York City, but the government rejected his application for ideological reasons. In an open letter to the International Committee on Human Rights, he protested that he had been deprived of all rights except the right to resign myself to my complete lack of rights, to admit that at 54 my life is practically over, and to get my invalid's pension and shut up. But as a result of an international campaign over his case, he was allowed to emigrate in mid-74.